So we're going to spend the next 40 minutes or so talking about what's next in open source. And we're going to give you a few of our thoughts, and we're going to ask you to, we'll leave some time for audience questions. There's a lot of ground to cover. So I thought the way we'd start is I'd ask our panelists to briefly introduce themselves so that you'll know who we are and can point at us since we have no name tags. So let's start down on the far end with Stormy.
So I'm Stormy Peters. It's good to see lots of familiar faces. I've been in open source software for a long time, but happy to be here talking about what's next. I started out my career working on open source programs offices and most recently worked at GitHub. Now I'm doing some consulting and some public speaking, so if anybody wants some help, let me know. And I've been working on creating videos, which I learned in the last talk I went to is a good way to recruit Gen Z.
So I've been seeing you produce a lot of great videos on LinkedIn. I love that. It's easier to connect with people. I'm Nithya Ruff, and I run the open source program office at Amazon. I also sit on the board of the Linux Foundation. I've been doing open source since 1998. That's roughly 27 years, something like that. I've lost count. And what else should I say? It's good to be here.
Thank you, Nithya. Lakkakula. I run the open source ecosystem at Microsoft. And actually, I started open source back in 1999 when Microsoft Halloween documents were released. So it's like kind of coincidence. But I was in the camp where I started open source, hated Microsoft at the time. My first 2 gigs were all like converting Microsoft products into open source products, like using Linux and Apache and all that stuff. That's how I started open source. And then after I got into enterprises, and now glad to be actually in Microsoft. Microsoft came a long way since then, and we are actually, as you can say, it's more like a hate-love relationship thing. Now they're more like, there's a lot of support for open source, and I'm glad to represent here.
Hi, everyone. My name is Hilary Carter. I'm at the Linux Foundation. I run the research program at the LF, which I've been doing since its inception in 2021. I've been in open source for almost 10 years, but my career began in financial services, where I spent the first 10 years after my master's degree in banking and industry, and transitioned into tech through communications and consulting. Before I joined the Linux Foundation, I ran a think tank called the Blockchain Research Institute based in Canada, where I hail from. I'm from the Toronto area. And it's great to be here to share some of my insights and to see so many familiar faces. So looking forward to the talk.
And you didn't say A.
I didn't say 51st state either.
No, you know, Canada has a bunch of provinces, and each province should ask for its own identity. Anyway, hi, I'm Tony Wasserman. I'm an independent consultant these days. And since everybody tells you when they started in open source, I must tell you that I was at University of California, San Francisco, and in 1979, we released software that ran on BSD Unix, and we distributed it with a BSD license. So I'm the oldest on the panel, and so I have this ancient history. I also started a company. We were one of the first 100 .coms, and we put open source in a commercial product in 1984. Sun Microsystems beat us to it, but I think we were second. I've divided my career between academia and industry, and these days I advise startups on how not to screw up in their first year, which is really quite critical. I help companies kind of get organized and manage, and that includes open source project offices. So, all right, well, thank you to all my fellow panelists for agreeing to be here and face the crowd and to face some questions. So let me start with a couple of questions to get us warmed up and get ready for you. One of the things that struck me, and of course there's this huge interest in AI and agentic AI, so that seems like a place to start. I'm thinking about some future, in fact it may be current, where an AI program in fact writes code, writes a program, and then decides to put an open source license on it, puts it in GitHub, and makes it available. How reasonable do you think that is? Is that happening? Is the quality of the code going to be any good? Right. So who'd like to take a stab at that first?
So if you follow my YouTube channel, I've been thinking a lot about how AI is changing open source software. I think it's quite likely, I think the code will get better that comes out of AI. I have no doubt about that. Will the AI decide to put it on like GitHub? I think that depends on the precedents that we set. Does it think that that's the thing to do with your software, is to put it on GitHub? Like, do we teach it that's the norm? I'm much more worried about we will stop contributing to GitHub because when you go to an AI and you ask it to help you write something or create something, it feels a little less like yours. It also feels like it's really easy to create, so why should you bother sharing it and putting it out there and maintaining it if anyone could just regenerate it with a prompt? So I'm much more worried that AI will decrease the amount of open source software out there.
So, but will some other AI agent come along and find that software on GitHub and decide to release it as a commercial product?
Next.
Yeah, it could happen. But I agree with Stormy that we are at risk of forgetting the basics of how to do different things. If we just rely on AI to do our research, to write code, to do everything, and it's not at the stage where you can just let it go. You've got to review it. You've got to find the right use cases for where AI fits into the open source ecosystem and also, frankly, into the software development process.
Yeah. So not many people know this, but my dissertation was in AI, and it was so far in the dark ages that, it's history. But I did a LinkedIn post not very long ago that raised the issue that, these LLMs and ChatGPTs do a certain amount of things, but they don't think, right? And they don't do reasoning, and they don't do medical diagnosis or automatic driving, autonomous driving, I should say. And so there's this whole other area that is at least for now, missing. So I think we have, I certainly agree with Nithya that we have a way to go, and we'll see. Do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, as I said, AI been here for more than 50 years, so I think what we're talking is more of a generative AI, which is producing more code. So I think in general, I do believe actually it's good for open source. It will definitely help to produce more code, more contributors to the open source. If you notice Frank's keynote this morning, he has actually a statistic about after the Copilot start being open to all the open source contributors, we're seeing more and more women and less experienced, less technical people start contributing to open source, which is actually a positive thing. So I think it's positive. For me, actually, AI, I would think more as it reminds me of a Harry Potter movie. It's like having a magic wand, and then you're saying a spell, I want this. But end of the day, it will do a lot of powerful stuff easily, but you have to be very clear about what spell you do. Otherwise, you end up with like a pink pig with like wings on it that you don't want to see it, right? Like you don't want that spell to be misfired. That means, end of the day, the wizard is the developer. You have the control. AI is a magic wand, in my view. And how do you use it? Make sure it's not backfiring it. Means it doesn't have vulnerabilities. The code is proper before we ship to the production is actually end up on us. But it will make a lot easier for folks to start contributing more and more to the open source.
I want to follow up on that, the getting people started, younger people or people that don't typically participate, because back to the Gen Z talk that I saw, they don't want to be mentored by talking to you. Like they're afraid of looking bad in public. Like they grew up in the digital age where that haunts you forever. And I think the AI takes that fear away, because you can ask it any stupid question and you could say, I didn't get it, teach it to me like I was 10, teach it to me like I was 5. So I think that helps onboard new people, having that mentor who's not really a person.
So what is your research showing you?
Well, a couple of things, but I wanted to latch on to something that, Stormy, you said about Gen Z. I'll talk about Gen X, because that's my generation, and what I'm seeing it among Gen Xers and AI adoption and open source transformation, in that there's resistance. And there's a tendency to be set in ways. At KubeCon Cloud Native Conference in London, England in, I think it was early April, we led a research roundtable called Building AI Product Using Cloud Native, and it was very graciously sponsored by Microsoft. And in that discussion, a number of people were talking about how do we get very well-established software developers to change their ways and to adopt efficient technologies and innovative technologies like AI. And it simply came down to, well, if you want to change a generation that's done things a certain way for a certain amount of time, it's called put it in the KPIs that year. And while there's initially a lot of resistance to the mandate of it's time to get efficient with our time, and it's time to lower our operating costs, a lot of people who started using AI for code development really liked it. So the Gen Xers are slowly getting on board, but they have to sometimes be pushed into trying new things.
Okay, good, thank you. So this last piece, one of the things that came up, of course, was bringing in new people, and this comes to the topic of sustainability of projects, which is a theme of several sessions during the conference. And excuse me, I don't know. Is the altitude? No. So I thought that following up on what Stormy said, what are the motivating factors that you get, or is it simply that the Gen Z community is largely entering into a world where open source surrounds them?
Can I take a stab at that?
Sure.
It is taken for granted, and it is something that's so readily available, and it's a part of, how you develop code these days is download and integrate and things like that. So I worry that people are not looking beyond the code and understanding the culture of open source, how to collaborate, how to create, what the legal aspects of open source are, and a little bit about the history of open source. You need to know some of that in order to sustain and continue open source culture and open source ways of working. I know that it'll evolve and it'll improve, but if you don't understand why certain practices came into being and how we use licenses, it's not going to be very successful. So I'd love to see more of that type of mentorship and education in governance, in collaboration, in community, in documentation culture, not just in coding.
Right, good, thank you. So this notion of mentoring has come up a couple of times, and if you look in the exhibit hall, there's some companies doing it, and there's some sessions around mentoring, and there's also a session on the graying of open source, whether that's the projects or the people or both. So it kind of implies a handover that's generational, and my experience is that that's a tough problem. What do you guys think?
So building on something that Nithya said, that we need to make sure that there's a culture that people are aware of and participate in, I think it's gotten really hard to figure out where to go meet the projects. It used to be, it was IRC, right? Like you had your source code and you went to IRC for the conversations. And now for any given project, they tried discussions on GitHub and it didn't really take off to replace like a Discord or a Slack. So now when you find a project, less people are coming to events like this in general. And so to connect, you have to connect online. Do you go to a YouTube channel? Do you go to a Slack channel? Do you go to a Discord channel? Like Twitch, Reddit, where are you supposed to find that community? There's no standard across all the projects. So I think that's one barrier to passing on your project to anyone, is if the new people don't know where to come meet you.
Reddit.
It could be Reddit.
Yeah.
Do you know the reason that you always get the Reddit responses first in the Google searches is because Google signed a contract with them for the data?
So I was very surprised to see that Reddit is one of the top 10 websites of all in terms of traffic.
It might have something to do with the fact that they have an agreement with Google.
I'll take a little bit different approach to it. I think sustainability is going to be actually more critical going forward, especially with AI adding a lot more code. Who is actually there to maintain and correct, right? But I think it's actually on most of us as I think small or big companies, especially the bigger companies. I think we need to start involve more, contribute more on the projects we consume. And that's one thing actually I like even though I've been there only for 6 months in Microsoft, there's a culture of, I think, contributing back more and even open sourcing most of the projects. So we're biggest contributor to the CNCF, and all the projects coming out of our org actually is start as a CNCF open source project. I think when you start consuming and start working on that code base, actually getting involved and contributing back helps. I think that is a way to actually build that sustainability bridge going forward. When the original maintainer who've been actually doing all the hard work until now, when he wanted to take a break, I think that these enterprise contributors need to take the baton and move on, is the way I look at it.
So, I'm thinking about the code that's generated by, one of these tools like CodePilot, and now, it gets old. It's the last version of the software, and now somebody else has to come in and maintain that code. Well, I can't read it. It's gobbledygook. So probably the next one to come in to maintain it will rewrite it. Right.
But Tony, maybe AI can be taught how to maintain old code, including COBOL and Fortran and things like that. And so you may actually be able to leverage.
But maintaining code written by humans is much easier than maintaining code written by machines.
But machines can understand machines. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I've got a stack of some Burroughs 5500 algol code.
LLMs can be trained on that.
Yeah, I don't think understanding humans' codes is not always easy, though. I've seen some code which I couldn't.
As have we all, yes. Anyone else on this?
I'll
Sure.
speak not on the subject of AI and sustainability, but open source and sustainability specifically. And that is to double down on the idea of open governance and the link to sustainability. And in fact, a year ago, Nithya, it was AWS that contributed the Open Search project to be openly governed under the Linux Foundation. And part of the decision-making behind that choice of contribution of a project of such size and scope was thankfully rooted in research that we had done that indicated that in creating an open governance model around an open source project, you are opening the door to increased contributions and the overall project health, also in terms of greater propensity of that project to collaborate with other open source projects, in particular security projects. And so I think the conversation around sustainability cannot be decoupled from governance, and it cannot be decoupled from security.
Thank you.
And sorry, foundations have become an important institution of kind of keeper of the practices of open source, if you will, and institutionalizing some of these open governance practices. Apache has a very strong culture. Eclipse has a strong culture. Linux Foundation has a strong culture. So I think we are all realizing that we need to support those institutions so that we can sustain the culture forward and the institutionalization of that culture.
Good. So another session, I went to the session, Nithya was on the panel about education. And it was actually an OSPOs in university session that turned into an education session, I think. And so, I taught open source in the university for many, many years. It was an elective, though, so not so many people came and took it. Oh, well. But what role do you think education, formal education, I should say, plays in this sustainability? And I think given what Stormy said about people learning by watching videos and picking and choosing their like, is that more likely to be the route of education instead of formal classroom instruction?
Want to take a stab?
So that's a really big, different question than the future of open source, the future of education. And I think we should all be thinking about it because I think education is changing. To be honest, I think it's time. Like, I don't know how many of you have kids or remember when you were a kid going to school all day and sitting in the classroom all day listening to someone talk at you was not your favorite activity. And then the kids would come home and watch YouTube videos about the things that they wanted to learn about. So I do think education is changing. I've always really liked open source software as a way to I don't want to say authenticate or to prove what you can do. So I find that the computer science industry in general hires what seems to me, I don't have data, maybe Hilary does, more percentage of people that don't have a college degree but are very qualified for the work. And I really appreciate that. So I think it's changing and it'll continue to change. And I think we've been leading the way in that space in this industry.
Yeah.
One of the podcasts I heard recently was talking about the fact that AI is enabling different modalities of learning. And so many kids were left behind in the old classrooms because there was only one way of learning. The teacher taught you and you had to read and you had to regurgitate it in classes. But now there's the doing through open source maybe, there's verbal listening, there's pictures, there's asking your AI agent, to teach you or to do research for you. So there's so many ways of improving education and open source or open source education and sustainability.
Yeah, I do actually have a elementary school going kid, 8-year-old, and it's amazing to see how he actually started producing YouTube videos. And how he learned was watching CapCut or whatever is that open source tool, how to create videos on YouTube, and he started fiddling with it. So I think that is the future of education. Like, I think the way we studied at the school is more like one-way listening. These kids are now, this generation, want to like tweak and fiddle and experiment and fail fast and move forward. I think actually open source is a way to like enable that kind of education going forward because it's easy for them to play with, experiment with.
And I think employers are beginning to pay attention. I know over the past 5 or 10 years, people submit their applications and they said, here's my GitHub login, here's the work that I've done, and being able to demonstrate the contributions that you've made to various projects or the projects where you've been a maintainer says a whole lot more than your grade point average in many respects. So I think that transition is happening, and it brings us back to open source, right? Did you have something to add? Go ahead.
I do, and yes, Stormy, 100% accurate to say that the people who have coding skills are not necessarily those who went through a computer science degree. Coding is a highly teachable skill, and it's open to anybody simply willing to learn. So that's really exciting. And I think the World Wide Web is disrupting the education industry increasingly. I think it's important. Also, our research that that published today on tech talent. The 2025 State of Tech Talent report also provides evidence to support the fact that hiring managers prefer credentials in specific open source project skills than they do traditional university degrees. So that's really exciting too. I will say though, hands up who heard Frank Nagel speaking this morning? All right, yeah. Was that not a privilege to sit and watch him deliver his expertise? And I thought how fortunate it would have been to have been a student in Frank Nagel's class and how inspiring that would have been. I personally loved school and I loved my lectures at university. And I thought Frank delivered a master class of great knowledge translation this morning. So I think what's important is that for the learner, they embrace the approach that works best for them, whether it's small chunks of digital learning, YouTube learning, experiential learning, or classroom learning, in-person learning.
Yep.
Exactly.
Good. I want to see if we can take some questions. There's a question here. Let me give you the microphone so that everybody can hear it.
Thank you. I'm Courtney Robertson. I'm a former educator, former computer science educator in high schools before winding up in DevRel, specifically working in WordPress. And I was instrumental in part of the FAIR project that we heard announced this morning come together. Yes. I'm empowered to do this work because I work at GoDaddy. I'm a mentor in the WordPress contributor space. And so the question is, I am seeking mentorship in OSPOs because GoDaddy has an open source working group. And I want to be able to empower more people. So I'm looking for how do I find mentors? We don't have a proper OSPO. We have just a working group. How do I find mentors?
We have an answer for you. So the To-Do group, which is a subgroup in the Linux Foundation, is nothing but a big community of OSPOs and mentorship opportunities. And there are a number of folks here who are in the steering committee, like Ashley. And first of all, there's tremendous documentation. There's a community of like-minded people that you can join. And there are people you can reach out to and say, how did you do this? Or why did you guys do this? Are you facing the same issue? So that is a great community. I believe there's a community of university OSPOs also called Curious, in case there are folks in the audience who want to start a university OSPO. And last week, a bunch of us were at the United Nations, and governments are also starting OSPOs because the needs are different, right? But the To-Do group, from a corporate perspective, is a fantastic resource. I grew up on that.
Yeah, and their guides are really first rate. If you go to the To-Do group's homepage, is todogroup.org, and you go search on guides, you'll see that there's everything from how to start an open source project to how to bring together a gang of unruly people and everything in between. So let me second Nithya's recommendation. There's also a session. Is it later today or tomorrow?
Later today.
Yeah. Okay, there you go. There's your
4 o'clock.
there's your plug. Okay, good.
And there's also, if I may, beyond the guides on the To-Do group, part of them include research specific to OSPOs, but I think we have about 6 reports published on linuxfoundation.org/research. If you search the term OSPO, you'll find a plethora of resources.
It's an annual...
survey plus a number of thought leadership pieces and studies about OSPO best practices and the evolution of the OSPO and all kinds of content.
And Stormy mentioned it in her self-introduction, but I met Stormy when she was at Hewlett-Packard 20 years ago, and that was about the first thing that looked like an OSPO that I ever saw.
I think it was between HP and Sun, I think right about the same time.
Anyway, good. So, question here.
Having also been doing open source since before we started calling it that, I think I'm old enough to ask this respectfully. How do we get the people on this panel next year who are the ones who are going to make this change happen? Because we are all, as Hilary mentioned, we're all kind of set in our ways. We know that we did it right the first time, and we're not open to changing that, and that's not how it is. So how do we bring in that next generation to tell us how to make the future?
So Abby, who's sitting right there,
And that was a great talk. Thank you, Abby.
gave a great talk. But I think it's recorded and the slides are there, and there's some great ideas for how to get younger people involved in your project. What I thought was a really good point that you made is that if you don't do that for a while, there's nobody to hand it off to. So we have to start, like, when you leave this room, do the next thing.
And I think intentionally mentor and find people who are in this industry. I had so many people walk up to a lot of us last week and this week saying, how do you do this? Or how do you start this? Or can you be my mentor? Or I think we should take the challenge you put out, Rich, that we should have a different set of people here in the panel next year or even in the fall.
And we should push them a little bit.
Yes.
Like, I was in a group last week at one of the breakout things, and we picked the youngest person to be our spokesperson, and we had to push really hard to get her to agree to stand up and say it.
That's right.
Oh, we were in the same group.
Well, I think so, and yeah, and you know, she had so many great points to make, but she didn't believe in herself or that she could summarize on behalf of that group. And Stormy is exactly right. We need to be behind, pushing, supporting, and seeing a new set of people. If you don't actively work it, it doesn't happen, right? Yeah.
There's a question back. Let me take one there and then here. Yeah, why don't you pass the mic? Yeah.
It's like the technology version of a telephone or whatever, you know, that game where you used to like.
Make sure Rao gets his mic back.
Hi, so I was just wondering, since you noticed, or you said that hopefully next year it'll be, you know, different panelists. I'm curious, how were you sourced to become a panelist?
And therein lies the problem. You know, I think a lot of us grew up together in open source, so we know each other, and so we sometimes really lean on finding people we know and we are comfortable with. I know I don't do a good job of finding new people who can come in and kind of speak. So you're pointing out a problem.
So that means you guys don't like us to be on the panel? No, I think talking to any of us will definitely start help bringing in new panelists. And I mean, Linux Foundation is actually very open to bring in anyone to be a panel. And that's how I started a few years back. I had no idea about open source. And
Submit a talk. Submit a talk.
Yeah, and I think I just filled out something for the Linux Foundation a few months ago, and I think I just got an update. And they asked if we would mentor someone, but also if we would give if we were willing to give talks with someone who was newer to public speaking. So
yes.
I'm always happy to co-present with someone. So if you're newer to it and you don't want to stand up there all by yourself, like, ask any of us or ask anyone if they'll co-present with you. It's always fun.
Yeah.
Panels, co-presenting are all great ways to kind of dip your toe and get in.
Yeah. There's another thing, and to come back to the previous question, which is, you know, you have to keep changing. You know, if you're in this field, one of the things that attracted me to computing very early and kept me there for all these years is that you're learning something new and different every day, and you're changing practices. And if you sit still, then you're out there maintaining somebody else's COBOL code. And so, you know, just think about open source 20 years ago, right, when, you know, most of us entered this area. You know, you go into a company, and the first thing you'd hear from them is, "We don't do open source." And my initial reaction to them at the time even was, "You want to bet?" Hey, the developers were doing it, and they just didn't bother to tell the managers. But you know, think about, even personally, what are you going to be doing next year? Are you going to be doing the same thing next year that you did this year? Or Is there something new to explore? There's some new project out there, some new discipline. All of us had to make, I think, a big change to accommodate all these advances in machine learning and AI. It sort of took a lot of people into new areas and forced them to explore. So, the chronological age isn't necessarily all there is to it. There's some people who sit where they are, and there are other people who, have lifelong learning.
Growth mindset, yeah?
Yeah.
I'll make an offer to say if there's anyone in this audience who knows somebody who wants to be on this panel next year, send them my way. I will take a personal interest in helping onboard them and setting them up for success. We have tons of resources, and if they are raising their hand, there are infinite numbers of people who will raise them up. So send them my way.
Great, thanks, Hilary. So the microphone has to come back over here.
I didn't speak yet, so I didn't ask my question. So making a couple of observations. Looks like you are right. I think Stormy and Nithya probably both said that we tend to focus a lot on mentoring, coding, and such. And I run mentorships at the Linux Foundation. Most of our projects tend to be code-focused, definitely. And I'm hearing from the conversation here that we have a need for OSPO-focused mentorships as well, and need for mentorships. And people have asked, why don't we do mentorships in other areas? As an example, maybe technical writing or open source management and so on.
Can you ask a question? What kind of?
Yes. So what I'm saying is, do you think that the panel, do you see a need where we could do something like that as a formal mentorships in that space?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. I think there are subgroups, in foundations, like the To-Do group should start a mentorship program for OSPOs. There could be a governance mentorship program where people get a chance to shadow people who are on the governing boards or, various the technical steering committees, et cetera, to learn what it means to govern a project, documentation, absolutely, and project management, community management, yeah.
So that reminds me that we should get Ana Jimenez to be on this panel next year. Yes. Yeah, she's runs the effort for.
And as we create mentorships and new ways of onboarding people, I think we need to be careful that we're providing it in a format that fits the demographic we're trying to bring in. So if, for example, we were trying to bring in my kids who are older teenagers and in their 20s, I'm not going to write a long tech doc for them. I couldn't get my son to talk to his high school counselor who was there to help him, right? So I think we need to think about what formats work best for the group that you're trying to bring in and not always use the same, I'll get on a call with you once a week.
Thank you.
So I have a question kind of about the future of open source as far as kind of what you think the future looks like with the kind of tension with the new cybersecurity regulations that are coming through, that companies have to meet these requirements with the kind of community that may just be hobbyists or people that are working on their passion projects that are going to have to deal with that tension on their side.
Yes. So, all right, go ahead, and then.
I think that's a very good question, and actually it's hard to predict though, but if I look at it, the supply chain security will be paramount going forward. The CRA require you to disclose every vulnerability in your product, and then, as you know, 90% of the code is come from open source. So open source will be a big part of it. And then sometimes I think it might drive some of the regulated industry to pick and choose some open source rather than freely accepting any open source like that. So we may see more regulation around those. But I don't think it's not necessarily a bad thing. It actually helps to have a stronger, healthier community around open source. Maybe the volume might go down, as much as, not as much as. That's why I look at. But I think that's on everyone's mind now, is like, how do we secure the open source? Especially with the AI. Actually, AI is helping with the open source, but at the same time, we're seeing thousands and thousands of like this small change in the typo squared packages being opened up. And actually, someone did an analysis about AI is making up some package dependency names which doesn't even exist. And malicious users are actually noticing it and creating package like immediately to like influence him. So we're going to see a lot more of those. So I think it would be interesting next 10 years, especially after CRA. But I'm not worried about it because we've seen those and we sustained.
Thank you. So we have time for one more question, and I think you have the microphone, right?
Okay. Yeah, so I have a comment for previous conversation and a question, so I'll try to make it fast. I'm on the To-Do Group Steering Committee with Ashley and some other folks who may or may not be in this room. And so one of our goals for this year is actually a mentorship program. So I wanted to announce that since a lot of people are interested. We didn't create it yet, so don't clap yet, but we are looking at it. And I did notice that the LFX portal has a mentorship feature. So we're evaluating that to create the program for To-Do Group. So I'll look out in To-Do Group Slack channels for an announcement on mentorship throughout the year. But again, don't hold your breath. It's still very, very early stages. But as far as my question, so there's been a lot of things that have popped up over the past few years. We mentioned the CRA, AI is a big thing, security before that. But as far as like that old like value question, like how do you communicate value back to the company? I'm wondering if there's new areas that you've explored and like which stakeholders you're talking to, anything new. So for example, with the UN conversations, last year I reached out to our ESG group internally, our environmental social government group, and they respond to our investors about like social impact. So just like wondering if there's other groups within the company that you talk about to communicate value.
Speaking for Amazon and OSPOs at Amazon, you've really got to talk the language of the company, and you've got to link it to what matters to the company in terms of how they measure success, right? How companies measure success. One of the areas that we've been working in is business continuity and supply chain management, because that speaks to the business about the importance of if 90% of what you're consuming in your software supply chain is open source, are you managing that open source? Are you sustaining that open source? Are you investing in the continuity of that open source? Is a relevant business question. And so that often gets more interest than just saying, we have to do our part, or we have to contribute, or we have to be part of the community. Those are all good things, but they are soft benefits that come along, and the hard benefit being we've got to protect and sustain, what we are depending upon and what we've built the product on.
So, great, thanks. We're out of time. We have people hanging outside. So I wanted to give everybody a chance to say one last thing, like 2 sentences, and then we'll wrap up. Why don't we start with Stormy?
I always like to end with, think of the one thing you got out of this panel. Like, what's one action you are going to take because of something you heard here or someplace else today? So I would love to see, feel free to tag me on LinkedIn or wherever, like the one thing that you took away that you might do differently when you leave this room, or might add to the things you do.
And create a plan for yourself in terms of how you're going to get involved in open source. Are you going to submit a talk? Are you going to do code? Are you going to read an article? How are you going to get involved? On the flip side, for a lot of us gray heads, how are we going to, do more mentoring? How are we going to spend some time in bringing up the next generation and give our slots to, others who can come up here and speak?
My hair's not gray, it's silver.
Yeah, I was about to say that. Yeah.
I color it, so I don't know.
I think open source is in our lives, our software, everywhere, whether you like it or not. Two things we got to be really watch out in the future is security, as I mentioned, and sustainability. All the good folks like started is actually now as like gray hair, or they're kind of gradually missing out them. So, and the only way we could fix both of them is you have to involve. It's not something one company or one person cannot fix it. There are so many opportunities. So I think be involved, embrace it. That's the only way we can solve it.
Great stuff, Rail. I want to. What I was going to say was close to what you're going to say, but and also to answer your question, we have data as a resource to help that decision making and that proof point, that engagement in open source projects, engagement in open source communities, improves an organization's security posture, it improves their innovation posture, and it improves the cost efficiencies around talent, management, and retention. Jim Zemlin mentioned it in his keynote. We have a plethora of resources that prove this out empirically. So I hope my wish for all of you is that you use this resource. All the publications are available under Creative Commons that help prove the elements of the discussion from today. So dig in. Thank you.
So I want to thank you all for staying. My metric for how a session goes is how many people leave. So I'm pleased with that, and I want to thank you. And I especially want to thank my fellow panelists here, all of us who've been doing this a while. And I appreciate their willing to serve. And now we have to figure out how to replace ourselves. Yes. Thanks again, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.